Parental narcissistic abuse leaves scars that often remain invisible to the outside world, but deeply etched in the minds and hearts of those who have lived through it. It is not the kind of wound that shows up on the surface, yet it alters the way a person sees themselves, their worth, and even how they navigate love, trust, and relationships later in life. And the reality is that many people don't even recognize that what they experienced growing up was abuse. Because when it comes from a parent, it gets disguised as discipline, guidance, or just the way families are. But when we dig deeper, we begin to see the patterns. And when we put words to those patterns, we start to understand the weight people have been carrying. I want to take you into the lives of people whose stories mirror countless others. These stories are not unique in the sense that they represent a widespread and heartbreaking reality, yet each one carries its own pain, its own confusion, and its own aftermaths. They illustrate what it means to grow up in the shadow of a parent who places their ego above their child's humanity. And they reveal how those children, now adults, struggle, survive, and eventually rise. One story begins with a woman named Alina. As a child, she was often told, "Why can't you be more like your cousin? Look at her grades. Look at how polite she is. You're always a disappointment." Every achievement Alina reached was minimized. If she came home with an award, her mother would glance at it and ask why it wasn't first place. When Alina worked hard to get into a good university, her father simply said, "It's not that special, lots of kids do that." Nothing she did was ever enough, because narcissistic parents don't feed on their child's success. They feed on superiority. And the more inadequate they can make their child feel, the more powerful they believe themselves to be. For Alina, this meant internalizing the belief that she wasn't good enough. As an adult, she found herself working long hours at her job, terrified to make mistakes, seeking validation from bosses and colleagues, and feeling a deep, knowing sense of failure even when she was praised. It wasn't until years later, in therapy, that she realized her inner critic had her mother's voice. And that realization was devastating, because it meant the voice that should have nurtured her had instead become the voice that haunted her. Another story comes from a man named David. Growing up, David's father demanded absolute obedience. He was the kind of parent who saw disagreement as disrespect and expected his word to be treated as law. If David expressed an opinion that didn't align, he was mocked, punished, or given the silent treatment. "You don't know anything. You're just a kid," his father would say. Over time, David stopped speaking up. He learned that silence was safer than honesty. He learned that blending in was better than standing out. And he carried this survival mechanism into adulthood. As an adult, David found himself in relationships where he couldn't assert his needs. He would shrink himself to avoid conflict, always accommodating others, even at the cost of his own well-being. He couldn't trust his own judgment because he had been taught that his perspective was worthless. That is what narcissistic parents do. They rob children of their voice. They create adults who second-guess themselves, who feel guilty for saying no, who believe that love is something you earn by compliance rather than something you deserve by existence. And then there is Sarah. Sarah grew up with a mother who used guilt as her primary weapon. Every time Sarah wanted to spend time with friends, she would hear, "Oh, so you'd rather be with them than your own mother. I guess I'm not important to you." When Sarah wanted to move out for college, her mother said, "If you leave, you'll break my heart. I don't know what I'll do without you." Her mother's needs were always the center of the story, and Sarah learned early on that keeping her mother happy was her responsibility. This type of manipulation creates adults who are terrified of boundaries. Sarah grew into someone who felt overwhelming guilt anytime she prioritized her own needs. She became a chronic people pleaser, putting everyone else first, afraid that asserting herself would cause someone pain or abandonment. It's exhausting to live like this, constantly scanning other people's moods, constantly managing other people's feelings, because deep down you believe that if they are unhappy, it's your fault. Now, let's not overlook another form of parental narcissistic abuse that often goes unnoticed: the golden child and scapegoat dynamic. In one family, two siblings, Mark and Julia, lived this out. Mark was the golden child. Everything he did was praised, even when it was ordinary. Julia, on the other hand, could do no right. If she got an A, she was told she should have gotten an A+. If she excelled in sports, it was brushed off as not as important as academics. She was constantly criticized, compared, and belittled while Mark was exalted. This split not only created resentment between the siblings, but also shaped how Julia saw herself. She carried the weight of being the problem child, even when she wasn't. And Mark, though favored, grew up with his own struggles. Being the golden child meant living under constant pressure to maintain perfection. He was terrified of failure because his entire identity had been built around being the good one. Narcissistic parents use this divide and conquer strategy to keep children off balance, to prevent unity, and to maintain control. These stories, though fictionalized composites, represent thousands of lived realities, and the aftermath is profound. Adults who come out of narcissistic households often struggle with anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and difficulty in relationships. They find themselves repeating patterns, being drawn to narcissistic partners, staying in toxic friendships, or working themselves to the bone for external approval, because that is the template they were given. And yet, despite all of this, there is something remarkable about these survivors' resilience. Resilience doesn't mean they escaped unscathed. It doesn't mean the pain didn't shape them. It means that, despite it all, they are finding their voices. They are learning to challenge the lies they were taught. They are realizing that their worth is not tied to performance, compliance, or perfection. They are learning to say no without guilt, to speak without fear, to heal the inner child who still craves the love that was withheld. Healing from parental narcissistic abuse is not a straight line. It is often messy, filled with setbacks, and complicated by the guilt that comes with naming what happened. Society tells us to honor our parents no matter what, and that makes speaking the truth feel like betrayal. But the real betrayal is what was done to these children in the first place. Speaking the truth is not betrayal, it is liberation. There is a moment in healing when survivors finally understand that they are not broken, they are not unworthy, they are not unlovable. They were children forced into roles they should have never carried. They were gaslighted into believing the problem was them, when in fact it was never about them. And when that realization hits, there is both grief and freedom. Grief for the childhood they never had, freedom in knowing they get to write the rest of their story differently. The courage it takes to break these cycles cannot be overstated. To choose therapy, to set boundaries, to confront painful family dynamics, it is an act of defiance against years of conditioning. It is reclaiming a life that was hijacked by someone else's ego. And while it doesn't erase the past, it creates a future that is not dictated by it. So when you hear stories like Alina's, David's, Sarah's, or Julia's, you begin to see a pattern. But you also see a path forward, a path that says you were never the problem. Your needs, your voice, your worth, they all matter. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are enough, exactly as you are. And maybe the most important part of healing is this understanding that love does not look like control, manipulation, or criticism. Love does not demand silence. Love does not use guilt as a weapon. Love does not force you into roles you never chose. Real love allows you to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, not for what you do, but for who you are. And that is the truth survivors of parental narcissistic abuse deserve to hold on to. Parental narcissistic abuse is often misunderstood because it does not always leave visible bruises or scars. Instead, it creates a landscape of invisible wounds that children carry silently, shaping the way they see themselves and the world. These wounds are built through patterns of behavior that are repeated over and over until they feel normal to the child. For example, constant criticism becomes a background noise so familiar that the child starts to internalize it as truth. When a parent dismisses achievements, belittles efforts, or compares the child unfavorably to others, the child begins to believe that nothing they do will ever be enough. That message sinks in deeply, leaving behind a lifelong struggle with self-worth. Another layer of this abuse lies in the manipulation and gaslighting that often happens in these homes. A child may express hurt or frustration only to be told they are overreacting, too sensitive, or ungrateful. Over time, this robs them of trust in their own perceptions. Imagine a child who feels invisible, whose reality is constantly denied. Eventually, they begin to doubt themselves, questioning whether their feelings are valid or whether the problem really is them. This kind of psychological conditioning creates adults who second guess every decision and are terrified of being wrong because being wrong in childhood came with punishment, ridicule, or shame. The guilt tripping is another form of control that leaves lasting damage. A parent who repeatedly frames their child's independence or needs as selfish teaches them that love is conditional. Statements like, "After all I've done for you, this is how you treat me," or "You'll regret not being there for me," twist the child's natural desire to please their parent into a burden of responsibility they were never meant to carry. The child grows up believing that their role in life is to take care of other people's emotions at the expense of their own. This makes it nearly impossible to form healthy boundaries as an adult because saying no feels synonymous with betrayal. Even the golden child and scapegoat dynamic functions as a form of invisible abuse. On the surface, the golden child may appear to have it easier, showered with praise and attention. But that praise is conditional too, tied to performance and compliance rather than genuine love. The scapegoat, on the other hand, absorbs the family's dysfunction, constantly criticized and made to feel defective. Both children suffer in different ways. The golden child under the weight of impossible expectations, and the scapegoat under the crushing sense of rejection and inadequacy. These roles divide siblings and create distorted identities, making it harder for them to see themselves clearly. The deepest wound of all is perhaps the absence of safety. A home shaped by narcissism does not allow children to feel unconditionally loved or valued simply for existing. Instead, love is transactional, based on how well they serve the parent's needs or image. When that becomes the template for love, children grow into adults who either chase validation desperately or shut themselves off emotionally to avoid pain. This absence of safety shapes how they relate to others and to themselves, embedding patterns that can take years to even recognize, let alone undo. The abuse a child endures under a narcissistic parent does not remain in childhood. It travels with them into adulthood, reshaping their identity and the way they approach every relationship. The child who grew up hearing they were never good enough often becomes the adult who believes they must earn their place in every space they enter. They may throw themselves into work, chasing external validation from bosses, teachers, or peers, because deep inside they never received unconditional affirmation. Each accomplishment feels fleeting because no matter how high they climb, they are haunted by the internalized voice that asks, "Is this really enough?" That question is not their own. It is the echo of the parent who raised them. This reshaping is especially visible in relationships. Many survivors find themselves drawn, almost unconsciously, to partners who resemble their parent in behavior, critical, controlling, or emotionally withholding. It feels familiar, even if it is unhealthy. The person may confuse this familiarity with love because it reflects the template they were given early in life. A child who had to work for scraps of affection may, as an adult, find themselves accepting crumbs from partners or friends, believing that love is something to be earned through sacrifice and silence. This cycle keeps them trapped, often repeating the same pain in different forms. At the same time, the lessons learned in childhood around silence and obedience bleed into adulthood. The child who was told their opinions didn't matter may grow into someone who struggles to assert themselves. They may apologize excessively, avoid conflict at all costs, and suppress their own needs just to maintain peace. For them, speaking up carries a deep fear of rejection, anger, or punishment, because that was the consequence when they dared to voice themselves as a child. This can lead to a constant internal battle, wanting to be authentic but fearing that authenticity will drive people away. For many survivors, guilt becomes a constant companion. A parent who used emotional manipulation, guilt, tripping, or gaslighting teaches the child that their role is to prioritize others at the expense of themselves. As adults, these individuals feel torn between wanting freedom and feeling obligated to meet the needs of those around them. When they attempt to set boundaries, they may feel waves of shame, as though they are betraying someone. It can take years for them to recognize that their guilt is not a sign of wrongdoing, but a conditioned response to a distorted childhood. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking effects is the distorted sense of self that results. Survivors of parental narcissistic abuse often do not truly know who they are outside of what others expect of them. Their identity was shaped around appeasing, pleasing, or performing, rather than exploring their own passions, strengths, and desires. This leaves them feeling empty, uncertain, and disconnected from their authentic selves. The abuse doesn't just wound, it steals clarity of identity. And until it is recognized, those old patterns keep dictating how they show up in the world and how they allow others to treat them. Recognizing and naming parental narcissistic abuse is one of the most difficult yet most important steps in healing. For many survivors, the word abuse feels too heavy, too final, too damning to associate with their parents. Society often reinforces this conflict by saying things like, all parents make mistakes. They did the best they could. Or, but they're still your mom or dad. These messages make it incredibly hard to accept the reality of what happened. Survivors often spend years minimizing their pain, telling themselves it wasn't that bad, or that they're being dramatic. But the truth is that until the patterns are named, they remain powerful, continuing to shape the survivor's sense of self in silence. One of the reasons naming the abuse feels so overwhelming is the guilt that comes with it. Children are taught to honor and respect their parents, and when those parents were also the source of harm, the survivor feels torn. They think, if I speak this truth, I am betraying them, or maybe it really was my fault. That inner conflict keeps people stuck in cycles of silence. But abuse does not stop being abuse because the person who caused it is a parent. Naming it for what it is does not erase the complexity of the relationship. It simply acknowledges the reality that was always there. Gaslighting within the family makes this recognition even harder. If a child ever pointed out the unfairness or cruelty of their treatment, they were often told, "You're too sensitive. You imagined that." Or, "I never said that." Years of being told their reality was wrong means that, as adults, survivors question their own memories and perceptions. Even when they start learning about narcissistic abuse and recognizing patterns, part of them wonders if they're exaggerating or misremembering. But the consistency of the patterns across different families and survivors provides validation. It shows them they are not imagining things and that their pain is real. Recognizing the abuse is not just about labeling the parent. It's about reclaiming the survivor's own story. It's about finally putting words to experiences that were confusing, painful, and silenced for too long. Once someone can say, "This was abuse," they shift the blame off themselves and place it where it belongs. That act alone begins to loosen the grip of shame. It allows them to see that their struggles with self-esteem, boundaries, or relationships are not random flaws in their character, but direct results of what they endured. This step also opens the door to healing because you cannot heal what you refuse to see. Without naming the patterns, the survivor often continues repeating them unconsciously, living in the same roles they were forced into as children. But when the truth is spoken out loud, even if it's just whispered in therapy or written in a private journal, it becomes a turning point. It becomes the moment when the survivor finally says, "I am not crazy. I am not the problem. And I am allowed to call this what it was." That truth telling is the beginning of freedom. Healing from parental narcissistic abuse is not about erasing the past, but about learning to live differently in the present. It begins with resilience, though resilience here is not just about surviving. It is about finding the courage to create new patterns despite the conditioning of childhood. Survivors often start this journey by noticing the small shifts, saying no when they would have automatically said yes, taking a pause before apologizing for something that isn't their fault, or recognizing when guilt creeps in and questioning where it comes from. These small steps may seem insignificant, but in reality, they are acts of defiance against years of manipulation and conditioning. Boundaries become one of the most powerful tools in the healing process. For someone who grew up being told they had no right to their own space, voice, or needs, setting boundaries feels almost impossible at first. It brings guilt, fear of rejection, and even backlash from family members who were accustomed to having full control. But over time, boundaries become a way of teaching both themselves and others that their needs matter. A survivor may decide not to answer late night phone calls from a parent who thrives on chaos, or they may choose to limit visits to protect their emotional stability. These choices are not selfish. They are necessary steps in reclaiming autonomy and dignity. Another critical part of healing is challenging the lies internalized during childhood. Many survivors grew up believing they were unworthy, unlovable, or defective in some way. Healing requires slowly and often painfully untangling those beliefs and replacing them with truths that their worth does not depend on performance, that love is not supposed to hurt, and that they are enough exactly as they are. Therapy, journaling, and supportive communities often play an important role here because hearing validation from others helps dismantle the false narratives planted by narcissistic parents. Self-compassion becomes both a challenge and a lifeline. Survivors often carry harsh inner critics that mirror the voices of their parents. Learning to treat themselves with kindness can feel unnatural, even indulgent, but it is essential. When they begin speaking to themselves with the gentleness they never received, allowing mistakes without punishment, acknowledging progress without minimizing it, they start to heal the wounded inner child that was starved of unconditional acceptance. Redefining love is another key aspect of recovery. Growing up, many survivors were taught that love looked like control, sacrifice, or silence. Healing means learning that love is not about manipulation or fear. It is about respect, presence, and care. This realization helps survivors not only create healthier relationships with others, but also with themselves. They begin to see that their role is not to earn love, but to receive it freely and to give it without losing themselves in the process. Ultimately, healing is about choice, the choice to no longer let the past dictate the future. It is about recognizing that while the wounds are real, they do not have to define the rest of one's life. Survivors can write new narratives, ones that are built on truth, freedom, and self-worth. Every boundary set, every lie challenged, and every act of self-compassion becomes proof that healing is not only possible but powerful. The journey through the realities of parental narcissistic abuse is not an easy one to face. And for those who have lived it, the weight can feel unbearable at times. Yet acknowledging it, speaking it aloud, and naming it for what it is becomes the first step toward freedom. These stories of children who grew up under criticism, control, manipulation, or silence are not isolated, and they are not signs of weakness. They are testimonies to how deep wounds can run when love is conditional and when safety is replaced by fear. But within those same stories lies resilience. There is a strength in every survivor who chooses to heal, who chooses to unlearn the lies, and who dares to believe that their worth was never defined by the dysfunction they were born into. Healing is not about erasing the past, but about writing a new future, one shaped by boundaries, compassion, and truth. It is a process of reclaiming identity, rebuilding trust in oneself, and understanding that love is not control or criticism. It is acceptance, respect, and presence. For every survivor, the path forward is not easy, but it is possible, and every step toward healing is proof that what was broken can be transformed into something whole.